welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, the podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we are going to talk Death of a Unicorn. For anyone who is not familiar with this film, this one stars Jenna Ortega, Paul Rudd, Richard E. Grant, Tia Leone. There's a pretty good cast going on here. Now, this one is an A24 film, and I'm going to just say right up front, for anyone who has been with me any number of years at this point, you know that I am not always the biggest fan of A24 films. I think the last A24 film that I saw that I really very much enjoyed and loved was The Whale. I don't exactly remember how long it's been since that one came out, but a pretty good click of time. I did really like Civil War, come to think about it, so that one probably is the most recent. This one is really sort of centered around Jenna Ortega's character in this one. Her name is Ridley, and essentially it's her and her dad. They are disconnected from one another. It's that angsty teenager, even though she is a college student, but she's really sort of aged down in this one. The wig that they gave her is also atrocious, just as an aside, but she's really aged down. She seems to act incredibly immature in this film for what her role is as a artsy, college student person. Her dad, played by Paul Rudd, is this lawyer for a well-to-do company. It's like a family-run company of just basically villains, essentially. And they are invited out to this property because the head of this villainous family, Richard E. Grant, Odell Leopold, is dying of tumors in his body. So essentially he has cancer, and Paul Rudd is going up as the lawyer to secure the line of succession and basically help the company survive after Odell Leopold passes away, right? And while they are going on their way to this secluded sort of resort cabin, they strike and kill a baby unicorn. And thus, the entirety of the movie essentially comes down to the unicorn's parents coming for revenge. And it's this whole story where they somehow turn this lore from the last unicorn into this big, huge story about how unicorns have kind of done this throughout the ages, yada, yada. Now, in terms of whether or not this movie is any good or whether or not you should go see it, I think it's going to depend. I think that the last 30 minutes of this nearly 2-hour film was really kind of cool. It was really interesting. I liked kind of what they did with the unicorns. I've heard some people say that, this kind of reminded them or gave them the idea of Cabin in the Woods, where you had all of those mythical creatures and stuff, and the unicorn came out and stabbed someone to death. So this sort of has that element. The difference being that all of the unicorns in Death of a Unicorn are cartoony-ish CGI. It kind of reminds me of the same sort of CGI from Snow White, if that makes sense. It's partially realistic, but mostly cartoonish. It doesn't necessarily match, in my opinion, with the rest of the film because it's not meant to be that sort of mythical kind of world. It is real life, real world scenario, and they have stumbled upon these mythical unicorns, which no one knows exists. But the unicorns are very obviously CGI for good reason in this film, but they're very fake looking CGI, if that makes sense. So it doesn't necessarily play all together with the film. There are obviously some couple of funny parts in this, which I feel because Paul Rudd's in it, so there's going to be some corny dad jokes and such, and there are, which I feel are fine. And overall, the movie is fine. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. I think the majority of the film is pretty slow. It is a slower burn. I think all of this pretty much, I think A24 kind of just does this anyway, is that a lot of A24 films are really based in some kind of messaging, and it's not subtle messaging. It's very overt messaging. And so a lot of the messaging in Death of a Unicorn is like that concept of not exploiting the natural world or the natural elements of the world for our own financial and personal gain. I think that really is just the whole Screamy McScreamerton of this film. But I just don't think that the execution of it was great. I think that this had a lot of potential. It could have been really good. It could have been really entertaining. It just wasn't really. It's sort of another one of those films, and sadly, we are seeing just a lot of those. The majority of films these days, I feel like, are those ones that kind of go right up to that line of just almost good. But then just miss the mark for one reason or another. I think with Death of a Unicorn, the biggest thing that was disappointing or that fell completely flat for me was just that the plot was so incredibly predictable. 10 minutes into this film, I knew exactly how this film was going to go. And I'm not saying that I was expecting this to be a surprise or to wow me in any way, but they really could have. I mean, we're talking about a real world setting where they stumble upon unicorns. Like, they could have done some really cool things with that, but they didn't. It's very formulaic. It's a very easy story to predict and to know what's going to happen. You know the ending from the first few minutes of the film. Like, once Jenna Ortega's character kind of reveals this thing that she finds, you're like, oh, well, now we know exactly how this is going to play out for the rest of the film. And you just have to sit there and sort of wait for it to happen. I think the entirety, like the whole of this story, probably could have been told in an hour, and instead it's told in 2. So there's just a lot of lag. There's a lot of waiting to get to the point, like a lot of filler in this film, which is really disappointing. And at the end of the day, this one just was not a wow. I think there were some good parts in it for sure. I think that this one is one that I would recommend like streaming once it comes out on streaming, but I don't know that I would recommend actually going to the theater to see it. And I feel like maybe a lot of people kind of feel that way. My theater was not particularly full for an early showing of this one on a Thursday, which is when I am recording this. I'm recording it Thursday night. So it just doesn't seem like there's a whole bunch of drive for this movie in the first place. I don't necessarily see this one doing particularly well in the box office, but potentially it could have some steam on streaming, but I don't know. I'm particularly disappointed by this one because I feel like the cast was decent and it had a decent potential of being a good film, but I don't know, it just misses the mark. It misses the mark like a lot of films nowadays seem to be doing. So this one is definitely not a total win for me. I'm not bummed that I went to go see it. I don't hate it or anything, but it's just the back to back of mediocre films is getting very disappointing to me. I really just want something that wows me again. I want to go and have that experience of like seeing Star Wars for the first time or seeing Predator or Aliens or Terminator for the first time. Something like that. I know people are craving original stories, and I think it's just not enough to give us something that we haven't seen before. I want something that I haven't seen before, but that's really good. And this one, unfortunately, just doesn't hit that mark for me. So those are my thoughts on Death of a Unicorn. I would love to know what you guys thought of this one if you have seen it. Subscribe to join the Movie Nerd family, and I hope to see you in the next episode.